Today, we're changing it up and diving deep into the murky waters of history's employment market, specifically the jobs that make your most dreaded Monday morning seem like a tropical vacation. Here on Decide to Thrive, we are beginning a new series covering the weirdest, most disgusting, and downright dangerous occupations that people actually did for a living. So the next time you're complaining about your boss or that broken office coffee machine, remember, at least you're not collecting urine from public toilets or diving into sewage with nothing but your lungs and regrets. Now let's count down the top 10 weirdest and worst jobs in history. And fair warning, maybe don't eat while watching this one. Number 10, Resurrectionist, or Body Snatcher, Invasion of. Before modern medical education regulations, medical schools faced a serious supply problem. Not enough dead bodies for students to dissect and to study. The legal sources, executed criminals, couldn't meet demand. Enter the Resurrectionist, the entrepreneur soul who solved this supply chain issue by digging up the recently buried. These body snatchers worked under cover of darkness, armed with wooden spades, quieter than metal ones, canvas sacks, and a remarkable disregard for both the law and spectral retribution. The job paid surprisingly well, up to several months' wages for a fresh specimen in 1800s Britain, but came with significant occupational hazards like prosecution, cemetery guards, angry mobs, and the occasional grieving family member with a blunderbuss. The most successful resurrectionists, like London's notorious Burke and Hare, eventually cut out the middleman of waiting for natural deaths altogether. They graduated to outright murder, accelerating the supply process until they were caught and Burke was executed. His body was, fittingly, publicly dissected at the Edinburgh Medical College. The profession became obsolete after the Anatomy Act of 1832 increased the legal supply of cadavers, but for decades, the resurrectionists represented the perfect intersection of gruesome necessity and moral bankruptcy that exemplifies our list. Number 9, Gong Farmer, Tudor waste management specialist. In Tudor England, before modern plumbing blessed our existence, human waste accumulated in cesspits beneath homes. Enter the Gong Farmer, tasked with emptying these pits when they became unbearably full. These unfortunate souls could only work at night, a regulation designated less for their dignity and more to spare the public from witnessing and smelling their labor. Armed with shovels and buckets, they would descend into the cesspits, remove the waste called night soil, and cart it outside city limits. The job was so repulsive that Gong Farmers were legally required to live apart from the general population. They often worked naked except for sturdy boots, as clothes would become irredeemably soiled. However, there was a silver lining to this putrid cloud. Gong Farmers were among the highest paid manual laborers of their time. The extreme health hazards, suffocation from methane gas being a common occupational fatality, and social ostracism commanded premium compensation. Additionally, they could sell the collected waste to leather tanners and fertilizer manufacturers, creating a rare early example of a recycling-based economy, though one you definitely wouldn't want to participate in. Number 8, Ornatrix, or Roman hairdresser-slave. Being a hairdresser might not sound terrible, but the role of an Ornatrix in ancient Rome redefined occupational suffering. These slaves, typically women, were responsible for the increasingly elaborate hairstyles of the wealthy Roman women, as seen here in a statue with hair that looks very fashionable for the day, but at the cost of her nose. The cruelty of this profession wasn't in the hairstyling itself, but in the punishment system. Roman matrons would often stab the ornatrices with hairpins or beat them when displeased with their appearance. Some kept needles specifically for pricking their hairdressers when they pulled too hard or made a styling error. The complexity of Roman hairstyles, which changed with fashion trends just as rapidly as today, required hours of intricate work. Styles like the Tudorless or the later beehive arrangements needed specialized training, dexterity, and incredible patience, all performed under the threat of physical abuse. Period accounts describe ornatrices working with burn marks on their shoulders and needle scars on their arms, physical reminders of their mistress's dissatisfaction. Unlike some other slave positions that might eventually lead to manumission through a loyal service, ornatrices rarely received freedom, as their specialized skills made them too valuable to release. Number 7, Leech Collector. Before pharmaceutical companies began breeding medical medical leeches in sterile laboratories, yeah, that's a thing, someone had to collect them from the wild. Enter the Leech Collector, quite possibly history's most dedicated buffet. During the height of the leech medical therapy in the 18th and 19th centuries, these brave souls would wade into ponds and marshes, deliberately serving themselves as bait. The preferred method? Wade bare-legged into leech-infested waters and allow the bloodsuckers to attach. The most professional collectors used aging or sick horses as bait instead, leading them through leech-heavy marshes. The animals would emerge with dozens or hundreds of leeches attached, which were then carefully removed and sold to medical practitioners. The human collectors didn't have it much better. They would scrape the leeches off their legs after a sufficient catch, store them in containers, and move to the next location. The blood loss was substantial, leading to chronic anemia, weakness, and susceptibility to disease. Why do this? Economics. At the peak of leech medical mania in 1830s Europe, a single leech could sell for the equivalent of a day's wages, but the cost was very high. Many collectors developed infections from dirty water, entering their numerous wounds, and some died from blood poisoning. As one historical account puts it, quote, "The leech gatherers were known by their sallow complexions, their feeble frames, and their premature old age." Not exactly a ringing career endorsement. Number 6. Sin Eater. Imagine being so socially ostracized that villagers only sought your company when someone died, and then only to transfer the deceased's sins to you through a bizarre ritual meal. Welcome to the life of a Sin Eater, one of history's most spiritually hazardous occupations. This was practiced primarily in England, Scotland, and Wales from the Middle Ages until the early 20th century. Sin eating involved consuming a meal placed on the chest of a corpse or passed over body. By eating bread and drinking ale in this ritual, the Sin Eater was believed to absorb the moral transgressions of the deceased, allowing them to pass peacefully to the afterlife. The psychological toll was immense. Sin Eaters were considered walking repositories of evil, necessary for the community but too polluted for normal social interactions. They lived as outcasts, typically in isolated hovels outside village boundaries. Payment was meager, a few coins or sometimes just the meal itself, yet the position never lacked practitioners, as it typically fell to the desperately poor who had no other options for survival. The last known Sin Eater in Britain, Richard Munslow, died in 1906. Interestingly, he wasn't forced into the role by poverty, but chose it to revive the practice after his children died, a rare case of vocational choice in a profession typically born of desperation. Number 5. Pure Collector. Before synthetic ammonia revolutionized industrial chemistry, natural ammonia sources were vital for industries ranging from textile dyeing to gunpowder production. The most reliable source? Human urine, and someone had to collect it. Pure collectors, also known as urine hunters in some regions, would gather urine from public toilets in private homes. In medieval and early modern cities, they negotiated with homeowners for their chamber pot contents and installed collection vessels at public toilets. The job involved not just collection, but also processing. After gathering their harvest, they would let it ferment to increase ammonia concentration before selling it to tanners, dyers, and other craftsmen. The societal position of pure collectors existed in a strange paradox. They performed work everyone acknowledged as necessary, yet they were treated as untouchables. As one 17th century account states, they walk the streets under clouds of their own making, announced by their stench long before they are seen. The most successful pure collectors in wool-producing regions could amass modest fortunes, but at the cost of perpetual social isolation and the health effects of constant exposure to ammonia fumes, which included chronic respiratory issues and chemical burns. Number 4. Toshers. Victorian sewer hunters. Beneath Victorian London's streets lurked the Toshers, scavengers who hunted valuables in the city's vast sewer system. With nothing but tallow candles for light and long poles to steady themselves in the flowing filth, they searched for coins, for jewelry, and for metal scraps that washed down from the streets above. The physical dangers were substantial. Beyond the obvious disease risks, sewer gases could asphyxiate or explode when exposed to candle flames. Structural collapses were very common as well. Sharp objects hidden in the sludge could cause wounds that quickly festered in the septic environment. Then there were the rats. Enormous, aggressive specimens that traveled in packs and would attack if threatened. Toshers typically wore heavy boots that they would steal from the shipyards and distinctive canvas tunics coated in tar for partial waterproofing. They developed their own slang and operated in tight-knit groups that were notoriously suspicious of outsiders. Despite the dangers, a skilled Tosher could earn more than many skilled laborers above ground, up to 6 shillings a day when the average worker made half of that. However, their careers were typically brief due to injury, disease, or death, with few surviving past their 30s. The Metropolitan Police Act eventually outlawed outlawed the practice, driving Toshers even deeper underground, both literally and figuratively, as they continued their dangerous work while evading authorities. Number 3. Powder monkey. Not that kind of monkey. Sorry. Imagine being a 7 or 12-year-old and having a job where explosion, dismemberment, and death weren't workplace hazards, but workplace certainties. Welcome to the life of a powder monkey. The child laborers who supplied ammunition to gunners during naval battles from the 16th through the 19th centuries. Selected for their small size, these children ran gunpowder from below-deck magazines to the artillery crews. Speed was essential. A ship that couldn't maintain its rate of fire would be overwhelmed by enemies. But care was equally vital, as drop powder could ignite from a stray spark. The mortality rate here was staggering. During battle, powder monkeys were exposed on decks, vulnerable to enemy fire, splinters, massive wooden shards created when cannonballs hit ships, often larger and more deadlier than the projectiles themselves, and the constant risk of magazine explosions. Their training included learning to move quickly while hunched over. Running upright would make them easier targets and more likely to be decapitated by flying debris. They were also taught to cover their powder containers with their bodies if fire broke out nearby, sacrificing themselves to prevent larger explosions. British naval records from the Napoleonic Wars indicate that ships expected to replace approximately 80% of their powder monkeys over a year of active service, a casualty rate that makes modern workplace safety violations seem trivial by comparison. Number 2. Plague Corpse Collector. During Europe's various plague outbreaks, particularly the Black Death of the 14th century and London's Great Plague of 1665, someone had to remove the mounting corpses from homes and streets. This inevitable task fell to the plague corpse collectors. Armed with nothing but vinegar-soaked clothes over their faces, which was the closest thing to protective equipment available at the time, these workers would enter homes where entire families had died, remove their putrefying bodies, and transport them to mass graves outside city walls. This job was so dangerous that it was primarily performed by desperately poor people, released prisoners, or those who had survived the plague and believed, sometimes correctly, that they had developed immunity. In London, collectors moved through streets at night with carts to signal households with corpses to remove. They used hooks to drag bodies without touching them and worked quickly, often stacking dozens of corpses on their carts. Payment was relatively high for unskilled labor, but the life expectancy of a corpse collector during active plague outbreaks could be measured in weeks. Those who survived often faced severe post-traumatic stress from their experiences. Perhaps most poignantly, many corpse collectors reported becoming emotionally numb after weeks of work, no longer seeing the dead as people, but simply as material to be moved, a psychological defense mechanism that allowed them to continue functioning but permanently altered their relationship with humanity. And number 1, the Mellified Man Producer. We've saved the most bizarre and perhaps the most disturbing historical occupation for last. One so strange that many historians debated whether it actually existed until confirming accounts were discovered in multiple separate historical traditions. A Mellified Man, or honey person, was a human mummy confectionery created as a medical treatment in ancient Arabia and China. The process began with an elderly person who, facing death, would volunteer to preserve their body as medicine. They would stop eating anything but honey, bathe in honey, and eventually die from this honey-only regimen. After death, their body would be placed in a honey-filled stone coffin and left to seep for a century. The resulting substance, part preserved human, part honey, was then broken into pieces and sold as medicine for treating broken bones and other ailments. The producer's role is unique on our list as both worker and product. The psychological state required to volunteer for such a process, consuming nothing but honey, knowing it would kill you, with the purpose of having your corpse eaten as medicine generations later. It represents perhaps the most extreme occupational mindset in human history. Chinese medical texts from the Tang Dynasty describe Mellified Men as the pinnacle of self-sacrifice and medicine, while Persian accounts suggest the practice continued into the 16th century. The process represents the peculiar intersection of ancient medical practices, religious sacrifices, and early attempts at preservation technology. While most historical jobs evolved from necessity, the Mellified Man stands alone as an occupation born from a bizarre medical theory that required willing participants to undergo one of history's strangest and most prolonged deaths for dubious pharmaceutical purposes. So there you have it, 10 occupations that make modern workplace complaints seem almost laughable by comparison. From the psychological toll of sin eating to the lethal hazards of powder monkeys, these jobs remind us that human history is full of people who endured unimaginable conditions simply to survive. So the next time you're having a rough day at work, just remember, at least you're not wading through sewage, looking for coins, absorbing the sins of the dead, or preserving yourself as a human confection for future medical consumption. If this journey through occupational misery has piqued your interest, hit the subscribe button for more job-related content and historical career deep dives. Thanks for watching, and remember, no matter how bad your job is, it could always be worse, and history proves it. Like if you like, sub if you sub, and share if you share. I'm Thrive. Bye.